On today's bonus edition of Locked On Bucks, we examine the rumor that came out yesterday vis-a-vis Brandon Ingram. Is there any merit to this? Are the Bucks actually interested in Brandon Ingram? And spoiler alert, is it even possible? Is there any way the Bucks could acquire him? Camille and I get into what you need to know about that rumor next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis. You can find her on the Technical Foul podcast, the Pack a Day podcast, the Carry the G in MKE podcast. And we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get. The show we put out yesterday, we talked about, oh, by the way, the Pelicans, would they be interested in Brook Lopez? And speaking of, there was this, I don't know, would you call this a rumor? It seemed like this was just a Will Guillory putting out, hey, keep an eye on Brandon Ingram, and there's teams that are interested in him. And then we kind of take these pieces and run with, oh, well, he did say the Bucks are a team to monitor. It doesn't necessarily mean Bucks are really targeting Brandon Ingram. So it was one of those rumors, reports that was out there yesterday that just seemed to all of a sudden sprout up into something much larger than, in all likelihood, it really is.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I had to go and look because I saw it on Twitter when people were like, hey, the Bucks have an interest in. I'm like, where's this coming from? So I checked Will's Twitter. I didn't see anything there. I went to The Athletic and I found the article that mentioned the Bucks and Brandon Ingram. And within the article, he's mentioning the fact that, free agency is normally a numbers game. Like there are teams that make sense for moves. And then as free agency goes on, those moves don't pan out, so you have to pivot. And it talked about how the Hawks were a team that were possibly in the Brandon Ingram sweepstakes, but then that didn't pan out. How Philly could have been a team as well for him, but then they got, Paul George. They don't really need that. Or Sacramento, but then they got DeMar DeRozan. So they were like, teams like the Bucks and the Clippers could use Ingram to boost their chances. And he says in the article, quote, but would have trouble assuming the massive financial risk of acquiring him, end quote. So it's one of those things to me where it sounds like, yes, the Bucks are interested because it's like, hey, it's a young bucket, like really interested in seeing how we could do that. But also, we don't have many pathways to really make this happen.
The report that was out there on Twitter, it's not a report. So the aggregating that took place on Twitter was, we won't name who put it out there, but as the potential Brandon Ingram landing spots grow thinner in number, the Milwaukee Bucks and Los Angeles Clippers could be teams monitoring the All-Star, per Will Guillory. As you pointed out when you read the exact paragraph in the story, quite a stretch. They included the teams like the Bucks and Clippers could use Ingram to boost their title chances, ... removing the biggest piece of the story and just immediately jump to the pressure on the Pelicans grows with each day that they fail to solve their Brandon Ingram problem. Look, and I, earlier in the day too, it first came across my desk, if you will, when our friend Ty Winch of the Eurostep pointed it out and also said what we're saying of, I'm not taking shots at Will Guillory here, but this is kind of the cons of what you get. And I'm not taking shots necessarily at the Twitter account, X account that put this one out there, but these are the cons within story aggregation that you get of, oh, that piece was interesting. Let me put that out there without putting out the other sentence to it. So that's how this first came to my attention when I saw the tweet from Ty and thought, wait a minute. I mean, I'm sure if the right deal came along and the Bucks weren't up against the financial restrictions that they have, they would surely say, okay, I'll listen. Let me kick the tires and see what this is actually going to cost us. But it doesn't even really get to that point in the reporting by Will within this story.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like the aggregation accounts, like I get the appeal of them because it's one place you can go and get a lot of information. It's like I don't have to follow these different people. I might not know who to follow, so I'm just gonna trust in this source to kind of just dilute everything and then give it to me and like just so I can be informed. But sometimes you do have to dig a little bit deeper into it. Like this example that we're talking about here, where someone might read that initial tweet and just think like, oh yeah, the Bucks are in on it. But as we mentioned, first of all, there's no real way to do that as a one-on-one trade between the Bucks and the Pelicans because of where the Bucks are with that second apron. They can't aggregate salaries, and there's no real one salary on the Bucks that matches Brandon Ingram's $36 million that he is making. Even if you were like, hey, just trade Chris Middleton makes a hair under 32 mil. That's not going to get it.
Yeah.
Brook Lopez, as we've mentioned before in the past, is 23 million, and then it continues to drop thereafter. So, like, unless there was a third team involved, maybe even a fourth team, like it would have to get one of those situations to make that move happen. But again, not sure how likely that would be for the Bucks at this moment.
So there is one way to get it done, but it opens up a whole different can of worms. And I suppose we've never even addressed the fit question just because it does seem like there's no avenue to making this happen for the Bucks. So we'll spend a little bit of time on, hey, would Brandon Ingram even fit with the Bucks and who would need to go? And that one way they could actually make a trade for Brandon Ingram, as you pointed out, the salaries of both Brook Lopez and Chris Middleton. I would add an asterisk on how they could actually get it done, including both those names. So we'll get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is sponsored by BetterHelp. And look, comparisons, it's the thief of joy. I'm sure you've heard that line before, whether it's toiling around on social media, constantly looking at what's going on in others' lives, rather than focusing on what's happening within your own. It's easy to envy what we see that's out there with others. It might look like somebody else has it all together on their Instagram or their X accounts, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and most importantly, it's suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today. Use that code and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. So we'll get into the fit question in just a second here, Camille. Well, you know what? No, let's start with that. Does Brandon Ingram fit on this roster with the Bucks?
It depends on who's removed from it, I think is the first part of that answer, because Brandon Ingram slides in at that three spot.
Let's just say this: Dame and Giannis are not removed from it.
So then it's like, okay, is he coming in and taking Chris Middleton's spot then? Like, is that part of the move there? So, like, theoretically, if you needed a starting shoot or small forward and Middleton's not there, like, you could take that chance. But Brandon Ingram, as I mentioned, he's a bucket. Like, that's the way I've always described Brandon Ingram. He has a really smooth offensive game. He likes to put up shots as well. Some might say he's not super effective at all of those shots that he's putting up, but he's going
to
get
code
those
for you.
Hey, you can look at the stats and make your own conclusions from that one. But the defense hasn't been there for him either. And we've talked a lot about what kind of pieces you need around this team, and defense happens to be a part of it. And on top of that as well, we've mentioned how this team has injury concerns. Now, while Ingram is younger, he has not played at least 65 games since his rookie year with the Lakers. Every year since then, there has been some type of ailment that keeps him out for a chunk of time. So that's a concern for him as well going forward. So, like, does he fit? In a way, I don't think it's the cleanest fit, but I'm sure there are some who would say if you can get a chance to get a 26, 27-year-old, scorer, you take that chance, and putting him next to Dame and Giannis, you can think of the offensive possibilities with that. But there are some defensive liabilities in that as well.
Yeah, last year the games played were the most since that rookie year that you referenced, and it was 64 games played. Now, um, look, kind of like when we brought up the name of Pat Connaughton on the show, and whenever you bring that name up, you kind of say it and duck, just in case something is thrown at you. But there is that contingency of Bucks fans that will be quick to point out, well, so what? Chris Middleton doesn't play that many games either, and he's injury prone. And look, I think you and I both talked about this recently on the show too. I mean, there's been a lot of unfortunate luck for Chris Middleton. I'm not going to call a guy injury prone for slipping on a wet spot and getting some other procedures done while he's rehabbing something else. But the fact of the matter is he's missed a lot of time since dating all the way back to the 18-19 season, Mike Budenholzer's first in Milwaukee. Just to put context on it, he's missed a significant, and actually I take that back. The year they won the title, I think he only missed 6 games. So he's missed a significant chunk of time the last 3 years, especially. So is Brandon Ingram. But I think a couple of things that you would point to, I'll get to the logistics that I teased in a second here, but you would have to assume in addition of Brandon Ingram to the Bucks roster, if we're even going to entertain that and start to move down that path, would come at the expense of Chris Middleton. He would not be on the roster anymore. So your view would be, okay, Chris Middleton, they're about the same size. Chris Middleton has a little more thickness to him than Brandon Ingram, not a lot more, actually. And that's not a knock on Chris as much as it's to point out how slight Brandon Ingram is. But other than that, wingspan, their size, it's about the same. You mentioned Brandon Ingram, where he likes to operate from. Pretty lethal in the mid-range, though we saw some more statistics pointed out in the last couple of days of, hey, by the way, you know who was the best in the mid-range last season, in the past couple seasons? Right, Chris Middleton. The one hang-up that I start to have is, look, number one, I think it's difficult to just assign playoff failures and successes to one player, especially when it's not a huge sample size. But I don't think Brandon Ingram has draped himself in glory in the 2 postseason appearances that he's had. He only averaged 14 points per game in that first round series the Pelicans had this past year. And the other piece of his game is, look, Chris Middleton is by no means a high volume 3-point shooter, but if you think, hey, I would like to see Chris take a lot more threes, I hate to tell you, you're going to want to see Brandon Ingram take a lot more threes. It is just not part of his shot diet.
Yeah. He averaged a little bit under 4 3-point attempts per game this past season in the playoffs. I mean, it was a really strange playoff run for him this past year as well, with just some of the times that he was not on the court that was cited by his head coach, and then the times where he did play. But to your point about the frequency, the volume of the 3-point shot, it's not very high for Brandon Ingram. But that's all cool. We discussed the fit. We get that. I got to hear, Justin, what is this hypothetical
how to get it done? Right. How to get it done. All right.
Be acquired. I'm sitting here like the whole time, like, how could they do this?
All right. We will open that can of worms and dig into, let's say this happens. Here are 2 things that would need to happen for the Bucks. We'll get into that conversation coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, we all love sports so much that we never want them to stop. But just as the playoffs have now wound down, we're starting to get fewer and fewer games. It means the sports aren't sporting like we want them to. But FanDuel allows you to keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, something for everyone every day all summer long. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, so if the Bucks were to get this deal done, you mentioned some of the contract particulars. So Brandon Ingram makes more money than Brook Lopez. He makes more money than Chris Middleton. Look, one way, I suppose there's 2 ways to point out here. One of them would be a series of moves for the Bucks. So something like we talked about yesterday, 2 days ago, when we said trade Brooke Lopez in theory to the Pistons. You bring back a Jalen Duren. There you get a big, and you save some money. And you could use that to, as we pointed out, names like Haywood Highsmith, use your tax or your non-tax pyramid level. Well, it would also free up enough money that you could then take back more money in a trade. Though, I would actually have to crunch the numbers again to see where would they be exactly, assuming that they make that trade, because I think what we said, it would save them $19-ish million. So that would take you down to about 169 million on your cap figure, which would be under the tax. But making this trade then, so that would make it possible to make another trade with the Pelicans, where in theory you could say, hey, you guys are looking to compete now and win now. How about you take Chris Middleton? You saw what he did in the playoffs last year. He'd be a great scoring option next to Zion Williamson. And we'll take back Brandon Ingram to get younger. By taking back the more money on Brandon Ingram's contract, you're going up, $5-ish million. It would also hard cap you at the first apron. So you'd be pretty close to that at 178. You can't go above that if you're taking back more in a trade. The other way that they could do it is, and I think it was Bobby Marks that I heard talking about this the other day, and this isn't exclusive to Brandon Ingram, to be clear. The Bucks could technically do this in any deal that's out there to get under that second apron, which, in theory, as we mentioned, hey, what if you trade one of those salaries that may not be quite as desirable? You don't have the sweeteners to add. Well, technically, this is one way that you could do it. You could make a series of trades with the same team. So in other words, again, we're not suggesting it's going to happen, but let's just say you were to trade out Pat Connaughton to a team and you said, we have nothing else to attach by way of draft picks. Maybe you're interested in MarJon Beauchamp, but because we're in the second apron, we can't combine salaries. We can't send out two, but we could send you Pat Connaughton for you can take back cash. You can't send out cash if you're in that second apron. We could send you Pat Connaughton for $200,000. And then in the second trade, we can send you MarJon Beauchamp for, whatever it is for that player if we're under that figure. So the Bucks could do something like that with the Pelicans, where you would say, hey, you need a big, and you also like Chris Middleton to basically replace Brandon Ingram. We can send you Brooke Lopez, and I suppose we'd have to check the Pels cap situation, but we can send you Brooke Lopez, and you give us cash. Then we'll send you Chris Middleton for Brandon Ingram. That should work under the CBA. So that is the way the Bucks could technically do that, but that's a whole lot of moving pieces just to basically, tread water. I mean, you'd be getting younger, but do you think Brandon Ingram is an upgrade over Chris Middleton? Upgrade, same as, or worse than? How would you classify him?
I wouldn't say an upgrade.
Best case is same as.
Yeah,
and that's
in my
the
opinion.
best case. Yeah.
Yeah, and then on top of that too, given the fact that he is on an expiring, this is the last year of Brandon Ingram's contract, and you would have to also look to extend him. And what would that number be? Is that number, I would assume, is going to be higher than what Chris Middleton comes back for. So is it worth having this 26-year-old at a higher amount going forward? Who, as we've mentioned, he has the mid-range game, not necessarily to the same level as Chris Middleton. He's not as high of a volume of a three-point shooter. What he does give you is that youth and the possibility of the improvement that can come with that. But the defense isn't there. One might argue Chris Middleton doesn't have that much defense left anyways, but we have seen historically Chris Middleton just be a higher IQ defender. So I think having those aspects and that on the team, especially also the playmaking of Chris Middleton as a secondary ball handler when needed, especially if he's running with bench units, I think you would really miss that if you sub that out for Brandon Ingram, who doesn't necessarily give you as much playmaking as Chris Middleton. And it'll be at a higher price point as well. So that's how I feel about it. It's an interesting concept. I can see why it's appealing to some people. It just doesn't necessarily tickle my fancy too much. So
in closing, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you place it on how serious the Bucks would actually be in acquiring Brandon Ingram? I'll start it and say a 1.
Yeah, I was gonna say like a 2.5, 3. Like it doesn't feel super real. But what I do think is real is the idea that the Bucks are calling around and trying to see like, hey, can we get attached them to this particular trade, or can we find a way to wiggle ourselves in here to be a third or fourth team so that we can try to get something out of this as well.
And look, once the dust settles on free agency, we can open up the conversation a lot more here and take the full view of, okay, here's everything that happened. I truly believe Paul George leaving the Clippers and going to the Sixers just caused seismic shifts to a lot of teams out there. And Brandon Ingram, I think, was impacted by it as much as anyone, because I think we all kind of assume Paul George, it's just a game of chicken and he's going to stay in Los Angeles with the Clippers. So then you wondered, okay, maybe Brandon Ingram's a Philadelphia target, that he could be a guy that they use some assets to get and they could pay next year and down the line. But when you look at everything that happened with some of these names and guys that took less money too, good players that took less money, it just showed you how much Paul George signing with one of the teams that had money to spend rather than staying with his own club really changed everything and just dried up all the money that was out there for other teams. So that certainly worth a dive into once all of this, the free agency period wraps up for all these teams. And we'll get into that in the coming days here, but both had a very, very small chance.
Yes.
This Brandon Ingram story that bubbled up yesterday is actually something to keep an eye on and could come to fruition for the Bucks. As we mentioned, Summer League starts this weekend, so we'll see if we get an update on the Summer League roster for the Bucks a little bit later today. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again later today on Locked On Bucks.